Today, I'd like to explain how we can arrive at the perfect piano practice routine. And this is perhaps not as easy as we might think. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. If there's one thing that amazes me, it's the number of articles and videos I see on the perfect piano practice routine. Most of them are pretty much the same, to be honest. Warm up, sight reading, work on technique, for which generally we're told to do scales and arpeggios, then maybe some technical exercises such as hand-on and others, and then finally, after all that, we can practice some pieces. Then it's simply a case of dividing whatever our available time is between these categories and maybe tweak the proportions of one against another a little. However, for many of us with limited time, that can be an awful lot to try and fit in. Now, while such routines might be great advice for any beginner, we all need a starting point, don't we? If we want to break into more advanced music, then I think we need to think differently. So today I'd like to go through how we need to work out for ourselves what the perfect piano practice routine might look like. The first thing I think is fundamentally lacking from many of these definitions of a perfect piano practice routine is consideration of what is the ultimate end goal. What we need to do surely depends on what we want to achieve. Now, for many people, the end goal might be to simply play some popular songs. In this case, we'll want to play largely by ear perhaps, or do we want to be able to play from arrangements, or of course maybe both. For others, it might be to get good enough to make a living from playing piano. And here, this branches out into many things, doesn't it? We've got a performer, accompanist, teacher, to name but the most obvious ones. Others might want to dedicate their playing to learning classical music. And again, there are those that really love Bach, others will want to play mainly Chopin, others Rachmaninoff. And here again, I find that the piano skills quite often we need to develop are different depending on the demands of the music we want to play. And of course there are other things such as do we want to progress through a structure such as the ABRSM grades or the equivalent. Again, there are specific skills then that we need to develop that will be tested at the exam. So in short, first I think we need to have a really clear idea in mind of what we want to achieve. Once we're clear about the goal, we can then start to consider what skills we might need to develop. Of course, here, there are certain foundation skills that we need, aren't there? And anybody who's followed a basic method should be familiar with most of these particular things. We've learned how to sit at the piano, we've learned how to hold our hands, we've learned the basics of moving our fingers, we've learned the basics of how to read music. You know, the generic piano practice routines we see can certainly equip us with these basic skills. However, I think to further develop the right additional skills, we really need to be practicing things depending on what we want to play. Now, this might sound obvious, yet how, for example, does practicing, say, sight reading help us play by ear if this is what we want to be able to do? And I think perhaps the first clear thing we need to be considering is developing our ability to get from whatever our source is onto the piano. And two main source points for me are either playing from music, which many of us do, or playing by ear, which of course many others do. However, there's also the idea of playing, say, from lead sheets, which is sort of a combination of the two. We have the melody written out in music for us, but the rest we need to apply by ear from named chords, for example. Now, for anybody wanting to play mostly by ear, then sitting sight reading for 10 minutes a day isn't going to be contributing to this, is it? Then if we want to play from music, whether popular or classical really, then regular sight reading needs definitely to be on the menu. The next essential thing we need to think about, of course, is developing our technique. Now, irrespective of what type or style of music we wish to play, we will absolutely need to acquire the piano technique required to do it properly. Now, I've often seen questions online along the lines of, what piano techniques do I need to be working on? However, I think this is trying to work things out in reverse. If we're starting from the techniques, then we'd have to learn techniques and then learn music that uses those techniques. So let's say we decide we're going to do scales. However, if the music we're trying to learn is mostly chord-based, then we're practicing a technique that we're not really using. We would be far better served practicing something that improves our ability to play chords. And I think this is further complicated by the fact that there are many people who truly believe that technique needs to be done independently of music. And for these purposes, they will use things such as scales, arpeggios, or exercises like hand-on. However, personally, as you probably know, I don't necessarily subscribe to this view. I honestly don't think technique can be separated from music. Technique is all about getting a musical, not a mechanical result. To play a piece well, we need to master the techniques that the piece requires. So say, for example, we're learning Chopin's E-flat Nocturne. Then we've got jumps in the left hand, we've got chords in the left hand, we've got a right hand that's mostly a singing melody on a single note. There's a little passage in octaves in there, and of course there are lots of tricky fast bits. Now, depending where we are in our piano journey, we might need to develop perhaps only one or two of those techniques, the others being things that we're quite comfortable with to the extent that they appear in the music anyway. So to illustrate my idea, let's say that the octave passage seems somewhat hit and miss. Now, one option might be to look for exercises on octaves, and some would say, oh, we should practice the C major scale in octaves as an exercise to help us with this. However, what's stopping us actually working simply on the octaves as they appear here? And there are lots of different ways we can practice such octaves. We can practice them in shorter phrases. We can do them with just the thumb. We can do them with just the pinky. We can double them. We can double the lower notes. We can double the upper note. All of these things mean we're essentially creating our own little exercises specifically out of the music we're trying to learn. And then as a result, we're practicing technique as part of our piece. To further help us, we can look for other pieces that contain whatever the difficulty might be in a similar way. And for example, if we're talking about octaves, then we could take that part of Rondo alla Turca, where we have octaves in the right hand, and we could work on this in a similar ways. So whilst I personally don't do any technical exercises or devote time specifically to technique, I'd argue that I spend perhaps 80% of my time working on technique, but always as it applies to the music that I want to play. However, there is a potential downside to this. One discovery I made is that, as human beings, we'll very often look for the path of least resistance. We don't want to work any harder than we absolutely need to. And for me, I've got to admit, this has always applied to piano. And there are many things on piano that we probably find fairly difficult to do. As a teenager, I found slower, expressive type music, such as the Beethoven adagios, Chopin nocturnes, to be easy. Well, easy, I use the term loosely. Yet anything with lots of passage work and runs, such as Mozart and, lots of other Beethoven, to be really difficult. So then, when trying to choose what to learn next, I'd look through the score, and if I saw anything in the difficult category, I'd simply discount it. To be honest, even in slower music with too many squashed flies on the page, I tend to shy away from it. The only real exception to this was, of course, learning exam pieces where, there are limited choices. But even then, I'd still look for things that I thought would be easy. However, this doesn't equip me to play some of the music I would really love to play. For example, I dream of being able to play Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu or entire Beethoven sonatas. Therefore, I think we need to consciously spend time working on things we find hard. And by that I mean the hard things that are preventing us from playing or even starting to attempt some of the pieces we would otherwise love to learn. Now for me, I think my biggest nemesis is probably speed. Even just short bursts of speed, as are very common in Chopin nocturnes, for example, can be unreliable in my playing. As such, I always have something to work on that is in a speed challenge, if you like. I'll take a different piece each month or two and focus on the fast parts of it. And I'll use all the different speed building techniques I've learned over this past few years. Now, I find this ultimately more rewarding and motivating than trying to hammer through Czerny's School of Velocity or similar studies, for example. On the opposite end of the scale, though, we should also spend some time improving the things that we find easy. And by this I mean learning pieces that we feel are on the easy end of the scale. I think this really helps us to finally develop the skills we already have. So for example, learning to play Traumerei by Schumann is probably not too difficult as an intermediate player. Getting the notes under control, having a nice enough interpretation is definitely within reach. Yet, then listen to that same piece being played by Vladimir Horowitz. You could be forgiven for thinking he has an entirely different score in front of him. So by listening to what he does, the details he calls out, we can learn a ton about how to interpret a score, yet something where the notes aren't totally beyond our comprehension. Next, however, try replicating this or even just elements of it. I personally was very surprised at just how difficult this is to do credibly. The mixture of voicing that he uses in different hands and passing the voices between the hands is really hard to pull off. However, by at least trying to replicate this, we're making ourselves develop our basic technique from voicing, the top note to selectively voicing any note within a chord at any time. Similarly, we could take a piece of music that we can almost sight read and then work on this from the perspective of producing the most beautiful range of tone possible. Again, here we're not focusing on notes so much but on sound, but this is still developing technique. Equally, we'll anyway likely find that there are one or two passages that really do need some work to play well. So in short then, what is the perfect piano practice routine? I suppose to answer the question, the best I can do is to explain mine and then give you some reasons of why I think it is. And hopefully this will help you think about your own goals and therefore what's most important for you. So starting at the beginning then, for me, my main goal is to be able to play classical music. I like to pass on my enthusiasm for it to other people, by this channel for example, and to occasionally record the pieces that I've learned. So to do this, I have a practice routine that's mainly based on classical music. Now, I don't warm up as a separate exercise. I generally don't play anything that's particularly physical demanding. So I'll start off with my sight reading, usually, to give my fingers time to wake up. And if I haven't played for a little while, then I'll play something like Bach's C Major Prelude to let my brain warm up as well. Now, I sight read daily, not necessarily to develop the skill of being able to play something I've never seen before on sight. However, to make sure that each day I'm spending some real time actually reading music, as quite often when I practice, I'm practicing a lot from memory. And then after that, I'm working on a number of pieces at any one point in time, and we'll generally spend anything between 20 to 25 minutes on each one. First, I have one or two easier pieces to work on. Now, I'll admit, when I first came back to the piano, I generally just wanted to practice the difficult things because those were the things that at first I wanted to, either relearn from my youth or learn because I'd just discovered them. However, the issue with doing that is, of course, you end up spending months working just on the same things. Of course, as we know, variety is the spice of life. And of course, it's the spice of piano playing too. So I generally try to make sure I have things that, I can get to a reasonably good standard within a month or so. Next, I have some pieces that I use for things such as speed building, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I don't generally intend to finish these pieces off in one go, and I'll tend to cycle through them. And, of course, because building speed is something that I know is difficult for me, I don't think it will happen overnight. So cycling through these things can stop us going on autopilot quite often. And of course, then when you come back to them later, it's actually quite surprising how easier they start to feel. And as I said earlier, I prefer to use real pieces than, more sort of contrived things such as Czerny's School of Velocity. Because let's face it, how often in a real piece of music do you have, a single scale going up 2 octaves, for example, as you get in these studies? I'll also have some main pieces. So these are things that I really want to be able to play, and it's not always necessarily the most difficult things that I want to learn, but they're the sort of things that I want to be able to remember for a long time into the future. And, sometimes I might not necessarily expect to master these in one go. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything with putting something to one side every now and then. Now, to help with these main pieces, I also select complementary ones, and by that I mean things that have similar problems to resolve within them. So for example, I was working on Melody by Gluck, and this has an accompaniment that you need to share between the hands. So at the same time as doing this, I learned a piece called Siciliano, and I also learned one of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words. And the reason is that both of these pieces need this same skill of sharing an accompaniment between the hands. Then, in terms of maintaining my older repertoire, as it were, I basically find it's good to devote 1 day a week to doing this. And it's almost, if you like having a day off practicing altogether and spending some time with some old friends and letting the batteries recharge. And if ever I really am having a bad day and I just don't want to practice at all, then on days like this, I'll just sit and play. And sometimes I'll just pull out an old jazz fake book and go through some, old standards and spend my time doing this rather than actually working on specific pieces of music. Now, I'm really fortunate at the moment that, especially with all work from home and things like this, I get to devote around 3 hours a day to practicing the piano. And, until that, I really only had about an hour first thing in the morning that I could use. But fundamentally, the additional time simply means I can work on more pieces now than I could then. Of course, let's not forget that this practice routine might well need to change over time. Say for example, we've mainly learned to play by ear and we're really picking up that skill well, but then we think actually it would be good if I could start to read some music. So in that case, we change our routine and we incorporate things that will help us read music. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching and look forward to seeing you very soon.